So what happens if you need to sell your property in order to buy another one? How do you navigate that from both the seller's point of view, but also as a buyer being involved in a transaction like this? In today's video, I'm gonna give you guys a total breakdown and hopefully demystify the sell to buy transaction, some dynamics that are at play here, and what you need to be aware of. If you guys don't know me, my name is Jankowitz. I'm a realtor based in Cambridge and Somerville, Massachusetts. I've closed over 300 transactions in the last 3 years. If you guys have any questions, make sure you hit me up on my Calendly link in the description below. And also, always understand that you can subscribe to this channel, comment, like. I put a lot of energy into this and I always appreciate it. Let's get into the video. So let's start at the very beginning. Where would be a scenario where you'd be in a sell to buy transaction? Well, where this happens is when a seller wants to leave their current house and buy a new house, but they can't afford that new house until they sell their current house. So there's basically two ways to overcome this problem. The most common thing is the seller will require buyers to include language that essentially says the offer is contingent on the seller finding suitable housing. And so usually what'll happen is that'll be communicated and a plan would be drawn up between the seller's agent and the seller. That will be then communicated to the buyers and buyer's agents so they know when they submit an offer, there needs to be a contingency around seller finding suitable housing. So how does this contingency work? Well, they can be drawn up differently and there can be a little bit of variation, but generally speaking, the way that it works is the seller will have a chance once their property that they're selling goes under agreement to then find a new property. If they can't find the property, what tends to happen within reason is the transaction timeline will be stretched out a little bit to give them a little more time. There is the possibility for the seller to ultimately back out of the deal if they can't identify a property. Or sometimes the offer will be renegotiated in some ways if things start to drag on. Now, one of the important dynamics at play here that a lot of buyers will not understand maybe right out of the gate is that they play a role in actually helping the seller find a new property. And that's around the idea of a buyer commitment letter. So when you as a buyer are putting in an offer for a property and it gets accepted, you now have an offer where it's contingent on the seller finding suitable housing. So in a weird way, you actually want to make sure the seller actually can identify new property and get that new property under agreement so your transaction can close. And so there's one thing in particular that you can do, which is get a commitment letter from your loan officer as quickly as possible. So why does this help? Well, think of it from the perspective of that seller, not the seller that you're buying from, but the seller that the seller is trying to purchase from. That seller wants to make sure that that seller is actually going to be able to close. And they're not going to be able to close on that transaction unless you guys close on your transaction. Once you as the buyer have your commitment letter, it's going to be much easier. So it's a little confusing, but the bottom line is you as a buyer want to make sure you get your commitment letter ASAP so that the seller will be in a stronger position to buy their next property. If they can buy their property, you can buy your property, everyone wins. There is another option here. There is something called a bridge loan. It's a loan product that maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with. A lot of banks don't offer them. I know loan officers that will offer these, but the basic idea of a bridge loan is exactly what it sounds like. It essentially bridges the gap. So essentially what you can do as a seller is instead of having that contingency in there around finding suitable housing, you can have a bridge loan, which you take out to bridge the gap to purchase your new property. And then, once you close, you can sell the property or you can list it at some point during the process. And as soon as your property then sells, you can repay that loan. They tend to have higher interest rates, but they're for a very short period of time and you can quickly repay them. So that can be another tool in the toolkit that can be helpful. And I would just add one more thing. There is a third thing that I do see occasionally, which is sometimes, even though originally the seller says, we want that contingency around suitable housing, sometimes around the purchase and sale, there can be a negotiation between the buyer's attorney and the seller's attorney, and they can come to an agreement that basically says, we're going to scrap the seller finding suitable housing, but in return, the buyer will allow the seller to stay a period of time after closing. Now, there is usually a period of time, usually it's up to about 60 days after the deal closes, that the seller can occupy the premises After that, it gets much harder from the buyer's perspective, getting to loans. This can get a little complicated. I'm not going to really get into it now. But the bottom line is sometimes you can actually, as a buyer, negotiate to have seller finding suitable housing contingency removed, which would open some doors to guarantee that the property will become yours after a period of time. Now, let's talk a little bit about risks of getting into these deals as a buyer. What are the potential risks? Well, the first thing is you're tied up in a property, but there's no guarantee that you'll 100% close unless, of course, you can negotiate away that seller finding suitable housing contingency, which you can do sometimes, but you can't always do. So you could be in a situation where you're tied up in a deal for 2, 3, 4 months. Then at the end of that time period, the seller may not be able to find suitable housing. They get back into the deal. You're back at square one. But not only are you back at square one, but there's an opportunity cost here, right? You've had 3, 4 months where time is going by, other good properties are coming on, and you can't look at them because you're tied up in this situation. So that's a serious risk that you need to consider. That's why a lot of times buyers will try and negotiate some kind of maybe use and occupancy agreement post-closing to give the seller additional runway, but also have a finite period of time where they have to leave and get rid of that seller finding suitable housing contingency. And as a seller, what's my recommendation? I think my general recommendation is understand the market, lean on your real estate agent. I know I say that a lot, but it really is true. Sometimes you can ask for everything under the sun, and it's going to be very easy to have that seller finding suitable housing contingency, particularly if you have a great property in a great location that's in very good shape. If you have a property that's not in great shape, that isn't in a great location, that's really something funky and weird about it, it's been sitting for a while, you've really lost that leverage point, you're going to have to be a little bit more flexible. But it really isn't the end of the world. Sometimes you can negotiate a very long closing. Sometimes in addition to that, after closing, you can negotiate a use and occupancy, which essentially allows you to rent back the property for some cost for a period of time after closing. So there are some flexible options out there. It just depends on your unique situation, your unique property, and then also market conditions. Anyways, I think the most important thing is you need to understand the dynamics of play here. I kind of gave a good overview, but there's a lot to unpack, and it's really best to chat with a real estate agent about your particular transaction and your particular personal situation, because it is a very personal situation. Hopefully this made some sense. If you guys have questions, make sure to hit me up on Calendly or fire away a comment. I try to reply to all my comments in the description below, and I'll see you guys next time.